So we were just talking about normal versus abnormal EKG tracings, and we finished off here with the atrial fibrillation, or AFib. It's a very common condition that approximately about 1 million Americans have, and a lot of them don't even know that they have this. It's not that big of a deal. You can live well with AFib. And it's not ideal in the long run because the atria do have a purpose. They're supposed to push maximum amount of blood into the ventricles, and if they don't contract properly, that means that the filling of the ventricles isn't ideal, and that means that the heart is sort of contracting without pumping as much blood as it should, and so the whole system becomes inefficient and the heart has to work harder, and of course that adds up to wear and tear over time. But it's not an immediate concern. Now, if you're going into a ventricular fibrillation, if you don't get on a defibrillator, and this will end up being a flat line, and the person will not make it. So ventricular fibrillation is an immediate, life-threatening condition. As you can see, there are no distinct QRS complexes of any kind, and the ventricles are not contracting; they're just twitching and not moving blood. And so, if this person doesn't get on a defibrillator, they will be dead within a few minutes. And then here, what do you think is happening on this abnormal ECG? What you can see, first of all, is that you have several P waves for each QRS complex, and also you have a very slow heart rate. So most likely, this is a bradycardia. Most likely, I would assume that the SA node doesn't work properly. Maybe the AV node has to take over as the pacemaker of the heart, and now you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You have only 6 cardiac cycles per 10 seconds, so 6 times 6, that would add up to 36, and that's a heart rate that's pretty typical of a secondary pacemaker when the AV node takes over as the pacemaker. Here's a slightly different representation of the of a cardiac cycle, and you can see you have on the ventricular side, you have this alteration between ventricular diastole, the relaxation part of the heart, so that's from here to here, and then ventricular systole, that will be the contraction part of the ventricles, and so you have the alteration. The atrial systole and diastole, they're also shown in the inner circle right there, but they're not as important as ventricular diastole versus ventricular systole. So, and here you can see that the ventricular systole is only about 1/3 of the cycle. The diastole part, the relaxation part, is about 2/3 of the cycle at rest. The heart sounds, they come about from the closures of the valves. The first heart sound, a lot of times referred to as the lub sound, that is due to the closure of the AV valves to prevent backflow into the atria before the ventricles contract. The second heart sound would be the dub of the typical lub dub, the heart sounds that you can hear with a stethoscope. The second heart sound is due to the closing of the semilunar valves, and you can listen to that through a stethoscope. And here is the all-inclusive Wiggers diagram, where you can see superimposed the EKG tracing up here, all the components of the EKG. Down here, you can see the pressure buildup in the ventricles. And so you can see here the depolarization of the ventricles. So the QRS complex is followed then by the buildup of pressure, meaning that the ventricles are actually contracting, building up pressure to the maximum. Then they start relaxing, coming down here. You can hear the heart sounds. They're put in here as the lub-dub sounds, first and second heart sounds, due to the closure of the AV valves. Just before you're building up pressure, you want to close the AV valves to prevent backflow into the atria. And then just before you are really relaxing, that's when you want to close the semilunar valves, because you just contracted, pushed out a bunch of blood into the pulmonary trunk or the aorta, the aortic arch. And so now you want to make sure that you're preventing backflow into the ventricles, so you need to close the semilunar valves. Down here, you have sort of the cardiac cycle down here. And one last thing, the filling of the ventricle. So up here, the maximum filling is when the atria have contracted and they put maximum amount of blood into the ventricles just before we are contracting. So this is called the end diastolic volume. Then the ventricles contract, they push out amount of blood, and then down here, this would be your end systolic volume. The difference between end diastolic and end systolic volume is the stroke volume. You might think that the heart is able to push out 100% of the blood that it's in there, but it's not true. You can see the end diastolic volume is 135 milliliters. The end diastolic volume here is 65 milliliters. So you can see that the difference, the stroke volume, it's about 70 milliliters. So 135 minus 65, that would be 70 milliliters. So here is a text slide explaining the stroke volume. The stroke volume is the difference between end diastolic volume and end systolic volume. Stroke volume about 70 milliliters, what we just calculated here. That would be this right here. And the cardiac output, and this is going to be a very important equation. The cardiac output is the product of the heart rate times the stroke volume. So let's say we are having an average stroke volume of 70 beats per minute, 70 milliliters, and the heart rate is about 70 beats per minute. So then our cardiac output would be 4,900 milliliters. And the average is supposed to be about 5 liters per minute, and the average person, of course, 4,900 mLs is equal to 4.9 liters. Pretty close. And what you see here is the dual innervation of the heart. It's dually innervated by the sympathetic and parasympathetic side. Of course, you know that cardiac muscle is one of the effectors of the autonomic nervous system. So here we have the parasympathetic neuron that is dropping acetylcholine onto the heart, the vagus nerve that would be, and is setting our resting heart rate at about 70 beats per minute. Now, sympathetic fight and flight kind of input that drops norepinephrine onto the heart will speed up that heart rate and will accelerate it from the resting heart rate of 70 beats per minute. So here you have both inputs, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic neurons. They dually innervate at rest. As you know, rest and digest, that would be the parasympathetic side. We're setting our heart rate with a constant drop of acetylcholine on the SA node at about 70 beats per minute, but you can, as you know, go up from the 70 beats per minute there. The way this is done here is, so the normal, let's first start with the parasympathetic stimulation. Let's say we're adding a little bit extra acetylcholine. So the normal heart rate is set by the SA node depolarizing at the gray rate right here, the gray line right here. I'm following it here with my purple pen. Now we have extra acetylcholine, there will be parasympathetic stimulation. That means it will take us longer to reach the threshold because we're hyperpolarizing a little bit here, and it takes us longer. You can see that the angle here is not as steep as at the normal heart rate. So it takes us longer to reach threshold. And there we go, fire our action potential. And then again, we're hyperpolarizing and it takes us longer. So instead of having 3 beats in this time frame, we're only having 2 beats. Now let's take a look at sympathetic stimulation. There we're going to drop some norepinephrine onto the heart, and that means our normal rate follows still the gray line, and it's going like this. Versus sympathetic stimulation, we are depolarized even when we come down from the previous action potential, and so we're not even going down to minus 60, and it's making that much easier to reach threshold again. So we're going to fire faster, and that will increase our heart rate. So here we have a much steeper angle, and we're going to fire the next action potential much faster. And plus, we're never reaching the minus 60 of the normal resting potential. Here's a flowchart summarizing what happens with parasympathetic input that will be due to acetylcholine. We're basically slowing down the heart rate. We're hyperpolarizing the cell, and the heart rate will go down. On the sympathetic side, we're going to have norepinephrine dropped in the heart, which will activate the beta adrenergic receptors. You're going to have more sodium and calcium, so positive influx. That means an increased rate of depolarization, which increases the heart rate. And our stroke volume, let's see what it's affected by. The stroke volume, of course, you can only push out what came in. So the biggest factor is how much blood is coming back, the venous return. And then, of course, not only is it how much do we put into the heart that it can pump out, but it also is the contractility of the heart. How much stretch does it have? How much strength does the heart have? And so here the stroke volume is mostly determined by the stretch of the individual myocardial fiber. So that's determined by the Frank-Starling law, and we're going to take a look at that in a sec. And then also a big factor for the stroke volume is the venous return. How much blood came back from on the venous side, and that is mostly determined by how well did your skeletal muscles pump the blood back, since we don't have another pump like the heart on the venous side. How well did your respiratory pump work, and then also to some extent the sympathetic innervation of the veins. Here's the Frank-Starling law, which basically takes a look at the stretch of the myocardium as indicated by end diastolic volume. So how much was the heart stretched out, how much filling was there, and therefore how much force can you produce. So here will be the force. And of course, there's a nice intermedium. So you want to have a nice filling, but not overfilling of your ventricles. So we started out here with 135 milliliters as kind of an ideal value. And then our stroke volume is going to be about 70 beats per 70 milliliters for a normal kind of stroke volume. But if you're overstretching the heart, say you're filling a massive amount of blood in there, then your heart is just not going to be able to pump that out. It's just way overstretched. And so the Frank-Starling law is sort of this relationship between length of the fibers and the force. So how stretched out the fibers are and the force that they can therefore generate. The contractility is basically the force that the actual contraction can produce, and there are some chemical agents that can affect the contractility. Anything that increases the contractility is a positive inotropic agent. And there are some examples given here: epinephrine, norepinephrine, digitalis, and they all have positive inotropic effects. That means they increase the strength of the contraction. There are also some chemicals with negative inotropic effects that would decrease the contractility. So here we have the catecholamines, the norepinephrine, epinephrine. Of course, they would all increase the force of the contraction. That means they're positive inotropic agent. A chemical that's very well known is the digitalis, and you saw that in the frog heart simulation that we would have. The digitalis has a positive inotropic effect. It affects the contractility of the heart. And here would be a flow chart showing how the catecholamines will increase cardiac contraction. You can follow that. So the epinephrine or norepinephrine, they will bind to the beta adrenergic receptors, and they go through a cyclic AMP second messenger system, and then in the end you're going to have a more forceful contraction. You also have a shorter duration of the contraction, means you're increasing the heart rate. Here, let's take a look at afterload versus ejection fraction. Let's maybe start with the ejection fraction because we already covered that. That's the percentage of the end diastolic volume, the amount of filling in the ventricles that were actually ejected. So if we started out at 135 milliliters and we went down to 65 milliliters, then our stroke volume is those 70 milliliters. Now your ejection fraction is the stroke volume, the 70 milliliters, divided by the end diastolic volume. Let's say that was 135 milliliters, so it's about half. On average is about somewhere around 50% here, 52% that your ventricles are able to push out. You might be surprised by that because that means about 50% of the blood that was in the ventricle remained in the ventricle, was not pushed out. The ejection fraction measures how much of the amount of blood that was in the ventricle was pumped out. Now, in contrast, the afterload is the combined load of the end diastolic volume and the arterial resistance during ventricular contraction. I don't have much more to say about this than this definition that's given there, but it's sort of the afterload is sort of what remains afterward and with a contraction.